It's a select gathering today. But the fortunate thing is that in our tradition, we don't emphasize the many numbers. We like the few. The select few are what counts. Lord, fortify my heart, open up the knots in my tongue, fortify my tongue, make me capable of communicating to you. Peace and blessings be with you, emissary of God. Pleasing blessings with you, O Son of the emissary of God. The everlasting and ever-encompassing mercy of God, and the gate through which we enter into salvation. Peace and blessings be with Hussein, and with Ali ibn al-Hussein, and with the progeny of Hussein, and with all those who were martyred with Hussein at Karbala. And would that we were there with you so that we could achieve success both in this world and in the hereafter. In the name of God, the merciful, the everlasting font of mercy, the giver of mercy, all praise is His, as is His due, and we can never fulfill what we owe to God. And peace and blessings are with Muhammad and his progeny, as is their due, and we can never fulfill our due to them. Peace and blessings of God be with him and his progeny. Today I will just say a few short things. I don't want to take up your time. And often in these sorts of gatherings you can only really convey one idea. And so I will try and reiterate again something that we're all familiar with. But first of all, I want to just quickly say that it's of course always your honor and your privilege that you, as a group who call yourselves the Mahfil Ali, a gathering which of course is honored with the blessed name of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, that you commemorate all of the significant dates of the births and the martyrdoms of the Imams. And it's very important that we do this, quite simply because by doing that we remember who we are, we're familiar with what our identity is, and we are capable of reminding ourselves of those who help us to perfect ourselves on the path to God, because we remember that in our path in this life towards God, we do not privilege ourselves or our family or our friends, but we privilege those friends of God who allow ourselves to perfect ourselves on that path to God. Because as the Prophet, as you all know, famously said in his introduction at the famous event of Ghadir, he of course asked everyone whether they did not agree that he was the first person they should think about. Was he not the one who had more right over them than they had over themselves? And since the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt have a greater right over ourselves than we do, then we need to recognize that right. And fundamentally, one of those rights that they have over ourselves is that right that we love them, that we remember them, that we cherish their memory, that we cherish their message, that we cherish their particular path in the world. Because it's not, of course, for their benefit, just like we do not pray for God's benefit, but rather we do these acts because they are useful for us. And so, these gatherings ultimately are, in some ways, rather selfishly for ourselves. It kind of comes around that by our recognition of what we owe to the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt, that we then realize who it is that we are ourselves. Now, today I will do two things. I will say a few things about the Imam whose martyrdom, whose passing that we are commemorating, and then I will say some things as a connection to, of course, what he said and what he told us about Karbala, particularly issues around etiquette, particularly issues around visitation and pilgrimage to Karbala. But first, to say, in terms of what do we think when we think of Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salam, the peace and blessings of God be with him. There are a number of things we might think about. What comes to my mind is fundamentally this notion of an exemplary teacher. Now, we know that our tradition is to a large extent defined by this Imam. It's partly a question of identity. So, it's been the case early on, but certainly in the last few centuries, that the term Ja'fari, because of the Imam, is associated with the Shia. So it's his name which, in a sense, gives us our identity. And the fundamental reason for that is because he plays such an important role in the definition of what it is to be Shia, what that tradition is. And he does that in a number of different ways. If you pick up any standard collection of hadith from the early period and even from the later period, what you will notice is that a vast majority of those narrations which deal with matters of faith and belief and the nature of reality and the other and practice and ethics and so forth are actually narrated from him. Very large percentage of the tradition is really defined by him. And what's also interesting is, of course, is that he is one of those figures who was capable of forming that tradition at a particular point in history where it was possible to do so. So I'm sure you're familiar with the basic historical sketch. He lived at the time on the cusp of the Abbasid Empire, in the time of the transition between the Umayyads, from the Umayyads to the Abbasids. So his life spans the end of the Umayyad period, which is very much a period of turmoil. There were a number of different types of revolts against the Umayyads, and a number of those increasing was actually from the wider circle of the Imam. For example, famously his uncle led a revolt, Zayd bin Ali. I'm sure you're familiar with the revolt of Zayd bin Ali. And there were a number of other cousins of his who were involved in upheavals, and even those of his wider circle. And then later after him, at least one of his sons was involved in the revolt. And what all of those revolts were concerned with was this notion that fundamentally what the Umayyads represented was not really Islam as people wanted it. What they wanted from a leadership, a political leadership, was a framework which would allow them to be good people, would allow them to realize their humanity, would allow them to fulfill what it is that they really wanted to be, and would continue, in a sense, to implement what the Prophet had brought. And so a number of these revolts were then undertaken in the name of the family of the Prophet. And already by the time of the Imam, there was a slogan which very much became central to the Abbasid revolution, as it's sometimes called, that the people who were not happy with the Umayyads would want a person who they described as al-Rada min al-Muhammad, someone who they would be pleased with, who they would want, who would be from the family of the Prophet. And in fact, what's very important is that the Abbasid revolution, fundamentally in that sense, was very much a Shi'i revolution. It was one which played upon the basic sentiments of most Muslims at that time, who very much were had a certain devotion to the family of the Prophet. And the devotion to the family Prophet was something which was engraved from the earliest time within Islam, within the Islamic period. So they wanted this. And there were a number of discussions going on around at the time of the Imam as well. There are these stories about people coming to the Imam and saying, well, look, your cousins, the Abbasids, are making these claims, but surely you have a greater claim because you are closer to the Prophet than they are, because, of course, you are an actual descendant of the Prophet. And there are various issues around the political desire or not. There's one very famous story which is repeated in some of the early texts, which I'm sure you will have heard many times, where some people from Khurasan come to the Imam and say, why do you not make a claim for the caliphate? You are the best person for it. And of course the Imam says, that is true, but do you really think the people support me? And how many people do you have in Khurasan who will, in a sense, obey every single word I say? And you're familiar with the story. It's a close companion of the Imam who's sitting in that. And this is maybe an apocryphal story, but it makes the point. There's a companion called Harun who's sitting there in with the Imam, and the Imam supposedly turns to him and says, look, Harun, there is an oven there, go and jump in the oven. And of course Harun goes and obeys. And the Imam turns to these people who have come from Khurasan and says, how many people do you have in Khurasan who are like that? So the point being made is that what is the point of making a claim to political authority if you don't have people who actually understand the overwhelming spiritual and religious authority that the Imam has? The goal is not just to be a political leader. It's not just leadership for its own sake, but rather it's leadership so that the Imam, following the Prophet, can fundamentally help people to purify themselves and to realize what it means for them to be human. So he's living at that particular time. Now, because of the upheavals of the time, he also had the ability to preach, to teach openly. There's a famous figure which is given that when he was teaching, whether it was in Medina or elsewhere, that over 700, in some reports 700, or over 900 people who then were famous as either jurists or narrators of hadith said that they had studied with Ja'far al-Muhammad. So you have someone who is very influential in his time, and he's influential, of course, amongst his close followers who recognize him as an Imam, as a wali, as a successor of the Prophet, and he's significant and has influence upon those who don't necessarily accept that, but they accept that he is a teacher who can tell them about the nature of the faith and about the reality around him. And also we see that he addresses not just these two type groups of people, the sort of his particular community of followers and also the wider Muslim community, but also that he engages with those who might be seen as being on the fringes of that community. Precisely because at that time when the Abbasid empire is established, and then of course Baghdad as a city is established pretty much at the end of his life, Baghdad becomes a very significant cultural center. Iraq always has been, in a sense, a very plural society, and a society in which there were a number of different creeds and a number of different philosophical positions. And so Baghdad then very quickly becomes a center for all sorts of religious and intellectual debate. This already is happening in his lifetime, and it becomes more and more the case later. So one finds an important aspect of the corpus which is reported from the Imam are the beginnings of these sorts of theological debates with the other. about the nature of God, about the nature of God's existence and what that means for us, about human acts and abilities within this world, and of course the nature of the afterlife beyond that. And there are a number of these sorts of stories which are narrated, which indicate the encounter between the Imam and these sorts of people. You'll all be familiar with the famous story that the Imam is supposed to be on Hajj, and this person who is described as a Zindiq comes up to him and says, prove for me, why is there a God or not? Now, this is a very interesting story, quite simply because in the later period, Zindiq literally means someone who either has a heretical belief or someone who's not outside of the fold of Islam. So it raises the whole question of, well, what is a Zindiq doing in Hajj? Right? Especially when you consider nowadays non-Muslims are not allowed in Mecca and Medina, as of course we know. So what's going on here? Well, there are a number of ways to deal with it. One is to say, well, actually, maybe at that time, a Zindiq meant someone who was from a Muslim background or something like that, but perhaps had a critical attitude towards their faith, or who perhaps was no longer convinced by their faith and needed convincing. Another possibility is to say, well, actually, maybe Makkah was not a closed space, and perhaps there were people of other faiths who were around at that time who were capable of debating and the Imam and other people, and it was a recognition that the Hajj was a particular type of gathering, a significant social gathering of that time in which these sorts of debates and discussions took place. So either way, what it shows you is that the Hajj, as far as the Imam was concerned, was a certain type of ritual of self-purification on the path to God, but also was a particular forum for discussion where the Imam, in his role as a teacher, could take forward that role and could affect that role regardless of who asked him. Because fundamentally, the role of the Imams was always to respond to those who asked them and to respond to them at the level at which it was necessary. As Amir al-Mu'mineen famously said, we are the princes of speech, so ask us. He says that specifically about himself, but it applies also to all the Imams. The Imams were there to respond to people, and they responded in the heat of battle, and they responded during the Hajj, and they responded at many other times. So in a sense, that's another very significant example for us, that ultimately, if we are going to be those who, as Imam Sadiq alayhi salam famously says in one statement, he says, be sort of those who call on our behalf to our particular cause, in a way in which not only in the way in which you speak and you preach, but also in your very character. So your very character, your comportment, the way in which you deal with others should be as much of a indication, as much of an honor for you that shows that you are a follower of the Imam, as the actual words you say. So you don't necessarily have to say, become Shia or whatever, but the very fact that you speak and you behave in a particular way should make your character attractive, so that people are interested in who you are and interested in making sense of, well, why are you the way you are? Because one of the fundamental issues we have in the world in which we live is precisely the notion that we're all interested in moral psychology. We're all interested in what people are and how they're made up. Everyone is interested in understanding the inner secrets of what people are. We no longer live in rather compartmentalized societies where there is a clear distinction between the public and private. Everything is public nowadays. And that has very bad connotations and effects, but also it can have a very good effect, because that allows you to say, well, actually, what have you to hide? and allows you to fundamentally bring out goodness and to say, well, actually, we are the followers of these people and who are the ultimate friends of God. And they bring you towards God. They bring you to the, in a sense, what I like to call the ecstasy of understanding what God is and what the Imam is. Bring you back to, these verses of the Quran, which again say, the qualities, the properties of the believers are those who, when the name of God is mentioned, their hearts rejoice in ecstasy. So there's nothing to be ashamed about for ecstasy in this sense. It's a good thing. So it's the way in which one behaves, in the way in which one is aware of God, the way in which one forgoes error, forgoes sin. And by here, of course, sin is also like doing things which are considered to be in some ways shameful or unacceptable in society as well. And those who are faithful, so they keep their promises. If covenants and trusts are given to them, they fulfill their trusts. And of course, one of the greatest trusts is that they speak the truth. And that they keep good company. Keeping good company is very important. All the Prophet and the Ahl Bayt always discuss the significance of the company that one keeps, because the individual that one is you develop, you live within a social context. None of us, the famous cliche, no man is an island. So it also means that every one of us is very much a product of our social context. And we, of course, have a role in forming that social context, but we're very much a product of that. And that does mean it relates to the sort of company that you keep, and the ends of that sort of company that you keep. And you keep the company of those who, again, remind you of God and allow you to rejoice in ecstasy. And you keep the company of those who, in the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen, are living. So you're all familiar with the famous saying of Amir al-Mu'mineen, to keep the company of the living and not the dead. And of course, what is meant by this is the living are those who have knowledge and those who have aql, and not keeping the company of those who do not have aql. Because one of the fundamental problems of those who do not have aql is that they tend to be arrogant, and they tend to be stubborn, and they are, again, in the famous sayings of Amir al-Mu'mineen, very hostile to what they do not understand. They are fundamentally not the sort of people you want to hang out with, because they will not help, they do not constitute good company, and they do not help you in the particular path of becoming that you want to follow in this life. Now, when the issue of ilm, knowledge, and aql comes up, of course, the Imam plays a very important role in the traditions which are reported from him. And the extent of that particular knowledge is quite wide. I don't want to go into some of the more esoteric aspects of that. There are plenty of very interesting and ecstasy-inducing hadith, which I don't think we have the time for, and it depends on what people are willing to bear as well. And we don't want to go into things like Jafar and issues around esoteric knowledge, which then opens up all sorts of other types of understanding, which again might lead us into a different kind of context. But what I thought would be useful is to take us to, for example, one of the early hadith collections, Al-Kafi of Kulaini. And the first famous book of Al-Kafi is the book of Aql and Jahl, the book of intellect and ignorance. And a large number of the reports in that particular book do come from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. One of these, which you will be extremely familiar with, is famously known as the report about the forces of aql and the forces of jahl, junud al-aql wal-jahl, as it's called. And it's a long hadith which I think really gives us a very good notion about fundamentally what do we consider to be good and what do we consider to be bad. How do we understand the notion of a moral compass that exists within us, which can allow us, which can give us a faculty of understanding good and discerning it from what is not good, and can act as this guide through life. And particularly a guide through life because in other traditions which are narrated in this particular book, you have this notion of the aql is that by which the merciful is worshipped, and that by which paradise is gained and obtained. So in this long hadith, a person comes and says, I was with the Imam Abu Abdullah, and with him were a group of his companions, and the issue of aql, of intellect, and jahl, of ignorance came up. And so the Imam said, you need to recognize the aql through its forces, and you need to understand jahl through its forces. So in a sense, like, what are the properties of these things? And so, of course, the companions, as is often the case in these sorts of reports, say, well, please tell us what these things mean, because we do not know anything beyond what you tell us. And so he begins this famous narration where he says, well, God created the intellect, and it was the first thing that he created or the first spiritual entity that he created, and he created it from the right side of the throne, from his very light. And he said to intellect, aql, he said, come forth. And the aql obeyed, it came forth. And then he said, go back. And again the aql obeyed and went back. And then, of course, God said, I have in you, in aql, I have created something which is truly great, and I have dignified you over everything else that I have created. And this dignifying over other things that I've created is an interesting echo of at least 2 or 3 verses of the Quran which say the same thing about the way in which the sons of Adam have been dignified over the cosmos. So the dignity of the human is clearly, in a sense, being glossed in this hadith to be related to the fact that humans have intellect. It's the fundamental faculty, as I said, which allows them to worship the merciful and to obtain paradise. And then it says, and then he created ignorance from the deepest, darkest oceans. And also remember, this is not, don't take this too literally. We're not talking literally about something which is being created from an ocean, something which is being created from a throne. It's the idea of something which is superior and privileged over something which is base and which is not privileged. And he says to jahl, to ignorance, he says, come forth. It doesn't do anything. He says, come forth, and he comes forth, and he says, and go back, but he doesn't do it. And in the words of the Imam, he becomes arrogant at his act, the fact that he can come forth, so that he doesn't want to go back. And then and then ignorance is condemned because it is not obedient to God, and it takes pride in a simple little thing like the ability to go forward. And aql does not take pride into that. So again, we already have this notion that pride is a vice which is not associated with aql. And what then follows in this hadith is that you have a long list contrasting what the forces of intellect are against the forces of ignorance. And these are basically qualities, right? So, on the one hand, faith is a quality of aql, kufr is a vice of ignorance, right? Good is a quality of aql, the bad is a quality of ignorance. Being truthful and verifying the truth and speaking the truth is a quality of the aql. Being obstinate and lying and telling falsehoods is a quality of ignorance. Being contented and pleased is a quality of aql. Being rebellious and discontented is a quality of ignorance. So it goes on. So basically what you have is you have an extended kind of parable in a sense, which is being given about the sorts of qualities that humans should acquire and understand, and realize that these qualities are very much being called forth within you, because all of us have an internal imam, as it said, and that internal imam is aql. But of course, if we then reject and do not hold fast to that internal imam, it becomes jahl, it becomes ignorance. And if you allow the ignorance to overcome your intellect, then it leads precisely to these different vices. So one has to always be aware of that sort of moral compass which comes within from that aql, and realize that this is a fundamental faculty which mirrors the role of the imam who is external to that who is internal. Now, as I said, there's a lot more which could be said about it. The Kitab al-Aql is extremely extensive, and Al-Kafi has lots of other things. But fundamentally, the important thing to notice is that this is a notion of an intellect which is, as they would say in the study of religion, enchanted. It's a notion of an intellect which ties you to something, which of course in the word aql comes from this root of tying to. It ties you to a particular vision of reality in which there is a God, in which the existence of a God is meaningful, and once you accept that there is a God, then you realize that you have certain moral obligations. And you have those obligations because that God has stipulated a particular lifespan that you have, and then of course there is an afterlife in which, in a sense, what you reap, you sow, you will then reap in the afterlife. Now, as I said, I didn't want to go into the more esoteric and wonderful stuff, about the difference between the exoteric and the esoteric, and the nature of the secret, and the secret of the secret, and the secret reveals the secret, and stuff like that. That's perhaps for another mahfil, and we'll leave that at that. I will then turn to the role of the imam in basically teaching us the etiquette of what it means to visit his ancestor in Karbala. Now, the work I've got in front of me is Kamil Ziyarat ibn Khulaway. It's one of the earliest, not necessarily the earliest, but one of the earliest kind of pilgrimage manuals that we have, which is very much hadith based. And it's actually not really like a pilgrimage manual in the sense that very little of it is actually formulae and litanies and so forth, but most of it's about the process. And I'm just going to pick out two things. One thing I wanted to pick out is this notion of that you find from the Imam in particular, and sometimes people take this very negatively because they think that this is an element of the otherworldly. You know, you're all probably familiar with the famous, I think, misconstrued dichotomy which Ali Shariati famously put forward between what he called sort of black Shiism and red Shiism, sort of a Shiism which is kind of dead, it's all about weeping, it's all about the afterlife, it's not concerned with the present, and the idea that he had of a revolutionary Shiism, which is alive, which is all about action and so forth. And that fundamentally, I think, doesn't necessarily understand what the nature of action is. One thing which one finds in this particular chapter, which is about the weeping for Imam Hussein alayhi salam, is that it has a certain privileged act. It's a certain type of commemoration that we do. So we are rehearsing what those who did before us did, and we're rehearsing what not just those within our community, our forefathers, did in remembrance of the Imam, but we're also commemorating something which is a cosmic response to the Imam. It's the response of the prophets, it's a response of the angels, and so forth. And so in this chapter you have a number of traditions from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, which talk about the fact that when the Imam passed away, the entirety of the cosmos wept for him. And one then asks oneself, what does that mean? So they obviously recognized an injustice, they recognized something had happened, but they also recognized that something was missing. Again, comes back to the ecstasy. What is the opposite of ecstasy? The opposite of ecstasy as an extreme sense of joy is an extreme sense of sorrow. So taking away the friend of God, taking away the one who reminds us of God, taking away the face of God, the Wajhullah, in the person of the Imam, affects the heart so greatly that one's only response can be this intense sorrow. And so when one acts in that particular way, and that intense sorrow has a particular external manifestation, which we call crying, is a way in which we affect not just the fact that you're heartbroken, but the fact that it's an emptiness in the heart. So the opposite of that ecstasy is the complete abandoned alienation of the self, because of the fact that the friend of God has been taken from you. So that's an aspect of what it means to cry, which the Imam indicates. And as I said, there's plenty more I could say about that, but I will just say a few more things about the adab. Now, for those of you who've been to Karbala, you'll know that there is a particular place which is associated with Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. It's known as his maqam. And the standard accounts are that when he would visit his grandfather, he would first go there. Those of you who've been, you'll know it's right next to the Furat, it's next to the river, and It was actually a small garden, a sort of a gardened green area next to the river, which was a place of solace, which was a place of preparation before he then actually went to visit. And there are a number of accounts which are then again given in the Kamil, and there's a chapter which is known as that which a pilgrimage to Hussein should know and do. Now, there's a particular extended account of how you should go to the Furat, how you should wash and prepare yourself, and how you should stand before your Lord as you approach the Imam. And one of the most interesting reports here is the very first one, where he is asked, what is the state of the person who goes to visit the Imam? And he says, you should go like you go to Hajj, when you make the pilgrimage to God, or to the precinct of God in Mecca. So there's a particular way in which you do this, and of course those of you who've been Hajj, you know this. The first thing is you go to a particular miqat, you do ghusl, you dress in a particular way, and then you go towards to Mecca. And he says the same thing. You'd go, you do ghusl in the Furat, you dress in a particular way, which is very simple, and you approach the Imam like you approach, in a sense, as it is due for the friend of God to approach him, sort of saying that I am here, O son of the emissary of God, to pay my respects, to renew my covenant with you, because fundamentally one of the important roles of pilgrimage is this pursuit of the renewal of the covenant, the renewal of the covenant with God, and fundamentally through the Imam. So you dress in a particular way, and then every single step you make towards the Imam, the angels bless you. They bless you, and if you go running, they bless you more. If you go slowly, but every step of the way, whether you go on a steed or not, is blessed in this particular way. And then when you go close to it, it is one of the precincts of the divine. And there's always this interesting question about, why is it, Karbala is one of the few places, I'm sure you all know, where it is actually your home. You are not a traveler, it's in a sense, in Karbala. Just like in Makkah, you're not a traveler. You're not allowed to pray like a traveler. You're not allowed to behave in a sense like a traveler. The same thing goes for Karbala. Karbala is as much your home as Makkah is, and the adab of relating the Hajj to the Ziyarah of Abu Abdullah is absolutely central. It's a central relationship which we need to understand. And then we understand that when we go to Karbala, and then we understand that when we go on Hajj. Every single step on Hajj reminds you of Karbala as well, and reminds you of that particular path. So, in this whole kind of system of the adab, of how one visits, how one is a pilgrimage in Karbala, is given to us by Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. And so this is precisely one of the key ways in which he does, not only does he define our tradition in an intellectual sense, but he also defines our tradition in a spiritual and practical and ritual sense of what it is that we do when we act and we express what it means to be Shi'i in the world in which we are. And I think I will stop there.
Salawat. We have a bit of time for questions, if there are any questions from either side. No? No questions? Okay, I think we'll end there. Salawat.